Hey guys, just having a little fun down here in the studio, and I wanted to talk to you about our midweek Bible teaching. This is week 3. We are in Ecclesiastes, and I am learning lots. I've read it before, kind of because I play music. There's that famous thing about like there's a time for everything, right? A time under the sun. There's a time for love and hate, and a time for war and peace, and so that just always has made good. Like kind of poetic stuff. I think I've even written a song about that, as many people have. But anyway, I get this great privilege to kind of talk through the next chunk, if you will, of Ecclesiastes. And it's been really cool. It's been a big eye-opening kind of thing for me. I've done lots of study in the last couple of days for this. But let's give a little recap of what we've learned so far. So we're looking at Solomon, King Solomon, the famous king who, Israelite king who was given wisdom by God, so he's known as like the wisest guy ever. And not only is he wise, but he was most prosperous of all the kings of Israel. And he's looking back on a life now of all those greatness, the great wisdom, the great prosperity, all the things he had. And he's older and wiser and looking back on his life, which I think many of us do as we start to get older as well. Looking back at his mistakes. One of those mistakes I have to imagine was the marrying of like 600 wives. That's crazy to me. Gentlemen, that's a mistake. Don't do it. One, right? Anyway, he's looking back. He's assessing his learnings. And he also in the book of Ecclesiastes, he's kind of like providing us views on God, the kingdom of God versus the world, right? The natural world. And so here are those kind of overriding goals that Dorian mentioned the last couple of weeks that we're kind of looking at as we read Ecclesiastes. Number one, that we need to set God as the only way. The God, the creator of the universe, he created everything, you and me, right? That we should set him as the only way. There's a lot of things in the world pulling us into other beliefs, and all roads lead, but God is the way. Okay. Second thing that we're looking at as we look at Ecclesiastes is this idea that we get this godly perspective on things of this world, okay? That we can gain godly perspective of things of this world. Things of this world meaning the tangible, the stuff, the things that we can obtain, the prosperity of things, and the good and the bad, but the things we can see and touch and, like the world, right? There's also things of heaven, which are a much different, plane, a different level, right? These would be including the fruit of the Spirit, the spiritual side of things, right? The kingdom of God kind of things. And then the third thing that we're looking at is this idea that we're going to strive to live a holy life. And I think that's what Solomon, and all of his wisdom, you'll see some of his cynical kind of complaining even, if you will, or like wondering what the heck, what the world seems meaningless. There's this understanding that we should be striving to be righteous and holy to the best that we can. Okay, so Ecclesiastes demonstrates. It's a book that demonstrates how faith really can triumph over doubt. So as you read through it, you'll hear some of the doubt that this wise man has of why are things unjust and why are these things happening the way they are. And yet, I think we learn when we read the whole book, which you have to read the whole thing to get the whole story, right? Is that faith trumps over that doubt. And you got to realize that this book was written in what might be considered kind of a dark time, or like moving into this world of despair. In other words, the promises of the Old Testament covenant, this promise that God had, that might seem, when he was writing this, distant, like that seems so far away, right? Also, the glories of the nation of Israel seems to be forgotten. The glory of King David, who is Solomon's father, and then Solomon, whose great riches and wisdom, and he builds the temple of God. This is at the end of his life, and it's almost like he's like, things seem to be fading away, that greatness, our glory. And there's also the hope of these prophets that had come so many times throughout the Old Testament days. There hasn't been one for a while, and so there's this kind of like, is God, where are you, God, right? But here's the thing, here's what I've learned from this book, is that the fear of God, the fear, the reverence, the obedience to God is the only sure foundation for the building of our life, right? Like the only of hope enduring the present, in other words, the world, the brokenness of this world, is to fear and obey God. And not a fear of, oh gosh, you better do it or the lightning bolt of God will hit. And I believe me, God has that capability. I understand it, right? I don't want to diminish his power. But I believe that this fear of God is more about our love, right? Our obedience to our Father in heaven because of our love for him. Just like my earthly father, right? I obeyed him to the best that I could, right? Not out of just the fear. There was fear that he would punish me, but it was more out of my love because I wanted to impress him or not have him be disappointed in me. I wanted to show my love to him. That's the same thing with our Father in heaven. So Solomon's going through this whole book talking about these things called vanities. In fact, my section that we're going to study today is some would call the second category or catalog of vanities. This idea of vanities of all vanities. It's all vanity. It's all in vain, right? And actually the Hebrew word vanity here is hebel, right? And it means because of different translations from absurdity, can't say that word, it's absurd, right? Frustration, futility, nonsense, emptiness. But I think really the word that seems to translate the best is vapor, right? It's meaningless. Vapor, like up in smoke, like smoke and mirrors. Like what's here today is gone tomorrow, like dust in the wind. Sounds like an old song, maybe you know it, right? I used to actually know it anyway, long story. But anyway, it's this idea of vanity, it's meaningless. And Solomon will talk throughout the book about that. He warns against a life that we're caught in this pursuit of empty and futile kind of pleasures that have no lasting value, right? In other words, life without God at our center is meaningless. And that's really one of the main points of today, okay? They're up in smoke, if you will. Another movie reference, funny, huh? All right, so Solomon in this, in his writing, I believe, to me at least, this is my personal opinion, just seems kind of cynical, even sarcastic in some of the things he's writing about when he talks about the brokenness of the world. Right? He looks at the vanities of the world, of a world living without God, and I think he sees it as kind of a cynical kind of thing, right? And so today, guys, I'm going to be covering a lot. And so let's get our Bibles out. And I'm in the NLT. I started in King James, got a little bit kind of hard to understand. I looked at NIV, NLT, and to tell you the truth, after that, I decided to jump into the Message and just get an outline of it, because the Message just kind of breaks it down, like people like me can understand. And I got a better understanding of it. But I'm in the NLT, so if you want to read along, we're going to be in chapters 3, verses 16, and then finish up chapter 3. We're going to do all of chapter 4, right? And then we're going to do the first 7 verses of chapter 5. So we're from chapter 3, verse 16, all the way through chapter 5, verse 17. I'm going to try to go verse by verse. Let's dig in so we don't take too long here. The first beginning of this is this idea that how God works in judgment. Okay, in other words, there's this idea that there's an injustice of life, and how does that look, right? And in here, all over, in fact, I think 27 times, saw that in Ecclesiastes, he will say something about nothing new under the sun. And this idea of under the sun, what happens under the sun is when we're in a life separated from God. It's a universal kind of point of view, that it's an earthbound perspective. So when he says under the sun, he's saying without God, the stuff of the world under the sun, right? Nothing new, right? Whatever it was, it's going to be gone and forgotten when it's without God. So in other words, life involves more than what happens under the sun. For living for God in his glory is the goal of our life, okay? That's a good point. We'll try to get back to that. So let's start off, verses 16 and 17. He says this, I also notice, this is Solomon speaking, that under the sun there is evil in the courtroom. So on earth, without God, yes, even the courts of law are corrupt. I said to myself, in due season, God will judge everyone, good and bad, for all their deeds. But at first he's saying, look, there's an injustice. Even in the system that's supposed to bring us justice, right? It's not right. He's saying, look, the righteous should be vindicated. That's what we want, right? We want justice for the good, and wicked should be punished. But that's not what was happening. He said the system wasn't fair. In fact, those that were making the judgments were the wicked. They're the ones who had the power to make these decisions, and it wasn't fair. There's corruption in this place of judgment and in the place of righteousness. And I think that many of us can see that happening even today in the world, where it doesn't seem like justice is really for everyone, whether it's the color of your skin or maybe the amount of money you have, that there seems to be a different justice for what power and status you have or even what race you are. And so some would argue that we still experience that today, right? And so Solomon's saying without the fear of the Lord, without this idea that God's in charge, when the earth under the sun forgets about God's great plan, that's all when the fear of God, fear of the Lord, when that's all set aside, right? The judges will not use their power well. There's no conscious system of what's right and wrong when we don't fear God. And it troubles him. To see the wicked men do the opposite of what is right and just, it ticks him off, as it does us. It should break your heart when you see that kind of stuff, right? But then he has this consolation, okay, but it's going to be okay. He says, in my heart, he realizes this, that God will judge the righteous and the wicked. So, hey, someone may get away with it now, and we feel that now. Some may get away with it, but we know, we've felt it before. Yeah, but God will get him in the end. God's the real judge. He'll get what's coming to him, right? And that future judgment, really, there's nothing we can do about the future judgment. That's a God thing. He's in complete control. But you can take comfort in that, but you also have to realize that judgment's coming for you and for me as well. All will be judged. And we're worthy of the same thing. And think about it. We're worthy, the Bible tells us that we're actually deserve death, right? The wages of sin is death. If it wasn't for Jesus, right? That's just the miracle, the rescue of Jesus, that he saved us from it. So that justice is for all of us, that judgment, right? But God's ordained this time, right? There's a time for everything, including judgment, okay? So let's move on. Now he's going to humble us. So Solomon sees this humbling that happens when he looks at this injustice and who we are. This is verses 18 through 21. It says, I also thought about the human condition, how God proves to people that they are like animals or beasts. For people and animals share the same fate. Both breathe and both must die. So people have no real advantage over the animals. How meaningless. It's like vapor, right? Both go to the same place. They came from dust and they return to dust. For who can prove that the human spirit goes up and the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So once again, he's speaking of God's work of judgment here. But when does judgment occur? Well, it doesn't happen until death. It even tells us in the New Testament in Hebrews, right, that there's an order ordained by God, and it's like life, death, then judgment, right? And so Solomon's telling us the way to get judgment is through our death. But he humbles us because he's like, look, you ain't nothing special. You die, so do the animals die, right? We all die. But you would ask, but aren't we better? Aren't we higher than, like my cat? One-eyed Gilda? Aren't I a little bit higher than her? More important than her, would you say? Yeah. But in here, he's kind of questioning this thing. But really, are we any different? Without God, are we any different than just the animals? We're all made of dust, right? Humans and animals. So, the Bible, Genesis tells us that out of dust we came, but it also says that the animals, like he says, the earth will bring forth living creatures. So when that breath that God gave us and the animals, right, when it's taken, we're back to dust. And I think there's a humbling thing that happens there. And in verse 21, he's really questioning this. So verse 21 said, for who can prove that the human spirit goes up and the spirit of animals goes down? He's like, how do we really know the natural man, right, of the world, whether our end is any more special than that of the beast? But we do know that judgment's coming. And we do know this, right, that animals don't seem to be part of this judgment. There is a distinction between man and beast, right, because of us being made in God's image, as it tells us in Hebrews, right? Man is, also in Genesis, right, that man is judged in the end, right? And so it's just interesting wisdom there that he gives us. Then he changes gears. So now in verse 22, he's going to start talking about, because of that, what we should do. So he's like, in light of all those things, the fact that the injustice is happening, and there's this humbling of, what, without God, you live, you die. He says, look, man, God's in control. We'll die, we'll be judged. He says, man, you just need to enjoy life and not worry about the future. So he says this in verse 22. So I saw that there is nothing better for people than to be happy in their work. That is our lot, our purpose in life. And no one can bring us back to see what happens after we die. So we can't see what happens later. We're limited as a human. So just enjoy life now. Just be present, right? Don't worry about the future. I need this because I worry a lot sometimes. And the wisdom here is don't. God's in control. He's got it, okay? You just worry about the present. Do your job, your purpose in life, right? It's not just like working at Walgreens or something. It's like this calling that we have to glorify, right, and to honor God. That's your enjoyment of your work and what you do is your portion or your lot. And that was given to you. Your purpose, if you don't know it yet, we should be always searching for what God's purpose is for us because it's given to us like an inheritance. So he says, enjoy your life now, right? Realizing that the main role that God plays in all of life, right? And then fearing him, reverencing him for that. All right, so far so good. Now we're going to move into chapter 4. And he does change gears here a little bit. Once again, this kind of section, I think we're going to find him talking, at least for the beginning of it, like, here's the world, but this is a world without God. He's not going to really put God into the picture here too much. He's going to talk about the following things in chapter 4. Oppression, work, companionship, the importance of having, relationship with others. If wisdom is good or not, riches, and just enjoying life. But he starts off with this awful reality of oppression, okay? See, oppression is noticed by Solomon, and it's noticed by God. He knows it, okay? But in this section, in the first section that we just, looked at, there was comfort knowing that God will eventually make things right. But in this section, you're not going to see that. Nor that cynical, like, I'm just telling you the way life is without God, okay? He's not in this picture. So here's what he says in verse 1. Again, I observed all the oppression that takes place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and with no one to comfort them. The oppressors have great power, and their victims are helpless. He's like, he notices the oppression, he sees it. Not just because he's the king and he sees, right? But even in spite of the fact that he's king, he sees the oppression of people. He sees their tears, okay? And he sees that there's no one there to comfort those that are oppressed. And in fact, sees that those that are oppressing, they're the ones who seem to have all the power, right? And I think this oppression and injustice that he's bringing up here is that it contributes to this idea that he says everything is senseless. It makes no sense. Look at these people suffer, and those bad guys are the ones who have all the power, and they keep oppressing, and no one seems to care. Remember, we're looking at the eyes of the world under the sun without God. That's how this is being looked at, okay? Just kind of through that lens, okay? And then he kind of talks a little bit about, like, okay, things are bad, injustice, oppression. It'd be better if you weren't even born, right? So he says that in verse 2 and verse 3. He says, first of all, so I concluded that the dead are better off than the living. You'd be better dead. Whoa, that's happy. Thanks, Solomon. But most fortunate of all of those are those who are not yet born, for they have not seen all the evil that's done in the sun. He's like, dude, you'd be better off not even coming in with a cynical view, right? I believe he's saying is like, man, a life apart from God, it's unsatisfying. It's not worth it. Right? But I believe this, and I think this is the message that we get later as we read through, that a godly man, a good godly man, right, he would never wish that he wasn't born, because in doing so, right, what is his job? To glorify the Lord. So if he's not born, he can't do what he was called to do, the joy of serving a Father in heaven like that, right? And then he's going to get into this idea of this having a balance of work. So he's changing gears a little bit, and he's saying, okay, let's talk about the work we do. He's going to talk about envy and laziness. So in verse 4, chapter 4, verse 4, he says, "Then I observed that most people are motivated to success because they envy their neighbors." And some would say that that's competition. I want to, right? I want to be like them. That competition or rivalry makes me better. But he's not talking about this. He's talking about envy. But this too is meaningless, like chasing the wind, right? He said, look, no one benefits from envy, the jealousy of others. Envy is truly vain and meaningless and profitless. And envying the abilities and skills and the labor of others is vain. So avoid it. There's quite often we can look at others and say, man, I hate my job, or I hate my house, or I wish I had more. We can look at others and we're just like, even look at others who don't seem to be following God and be like, it doesn't seem fair. I want what they have. They have a great job, great wife, great house, whatever it is, great stuff. And we can envy it. And Solomon here is telling us, nah, you gotta stay away from that. Avoid the envy, right? Because envy prevents people from actually finding satisfaction in their own work. Remember, he's calling us to find happiness and contentment in what we do, what we're called to do from God. And I know often those who work hard, they prosper, don't they? Like, sometimes we look at rich people or people who have stuff and we're like, well, that was just given to them. That's true for a small number of people. But a lot of people that are wealthy and prosperous and doing well have worked hard to get it, right? And it can cause us to be envious, right? Then he moves into this idea of laziness or idleness, right? And he tells us to look out for that too. He says this in verse 5. Fools fold their idle hands, leading them to ruin, right? Right? Fold their hands, whatever it is, like, I ain't gonna do nothing, right? In the Message version, it says that fools sit back, take it easy, and his sloth is a slow suicide. Whoa. And it's like spitting in the wind. You ever spit in the wind? Don't try it. It has a bad result, guys. Right? But the fool sits back and folds his hand. He doesn't work. And if he doesn't work, he doesn't eat. In some versions, it doesn't just say that it's his ruin. It says that he eats his own flesh. Why? It's his own detriment. He dies. I don't have any food. Right? It's just, you got to work. Right? In some way or another, that's you have to find a way to provide and to work. But he also says there's a balance. Right? He says, and he tells us to be happy. Don't worry, right? Be happy. Here's what he says in verse 6. He says, and yet, better to have, this is the balance part, better to have one handful with quietness than two handfuls with hard work and chasing the wind. You need a balance. Like, sure, if you're going to give me gold and you give me one handful, yeah. Or, I don't know, yeah. Or if you give me two handfuls of gold, that's even better, right? But what if there's two handfuls? Now it's heavy and there's stress and anxiety included in that. Maybe it's better to just have one hand and have a balance, things in moderation, right? Not the extremeness of just being lazy and you don't have anything, and not the working too much, like where that's all you do, but a middle ground where you find a balance in the realities of work, okay? Sounds good. I think moderation's pretty good. Then he moves in verse 7, we talk about this idea of the benefits of companionship, right? The benefits of companionship. So verse 7 and 8, he says this, I observed yet another example of something meaningless under the sun. This is the case of a man who is all alone, without a child or a brother, yet who works hard to gain as much wealth as he can. But then he asks himself, who am I working for? And why am I giving up so much pleasure now? It's also meaningless and depressing, right? Like vapor, it's vanity. He's saying, look, this man is just one, he's alone, and it's not good. And he's working hard, but for who? And we see this kind of negative argument for companionship here, that the man who doesn't have anyone else to share his work, right? So first of all, he's alone, but when we are in relationship with others, there's more purpose and meaning to what we do. And we can share the wealth and the fruits with someone else. When it's all for us, we're empty. We just want to keep getting more and more of the worldly, natural, earthly things, and we don't have anyone to share it with. So he's not happy with his riches, and yet he's not able to improve the life of others. So all this stuff isn't making you happy. He's still empty, right? There's no God peace here. And he's not able to improve the life of others because there is no one else. It's just him, right? And so I think this emphasizes the frustration of working or laboring for what seems like little or no purpose. And this was true for myself. I know this, is that 20 years ago, I was the person working for me. I mean, I knew people and had a family, but like, I was all about me. I went, I'm in my 30s. By then I should be, just as well off, if not more, than my dad. I should have it together. I should be some kind of, boss or manager, some kind of great leadership with great paycheck and a great house. And you can get that way. But it wasn't until that God got his hooks in me that I realized, man, it isn't about that. It's about my purpose. It's about serving God and serving others. And that's where the contentment has been just bringing me peace and joy. Not that there's not still trials, right? But this whole companionship thing, it's important, right? And he's going to give us some more wisdom on why that's important when it comes to like companionship and work. So in verses 9 through 12, he says this: 2 people are better off than one, right? 2 is better than 1, for they can help each other succeed. If one person falls, the other can reach out and help. But someone who falls alone is in real trouble. Likewise, 2 people lying close together can keep each other warm. But how can one be warm alone? A person standing alone can be attacked and defeated, but 2 can stand back to back and conquer, right? Protection. And then 3 are even better. For a triple braided cord is not easily broken. There's a lot going on here, but he's like, look, 2 is better than 1. You can get more done, right? When you work together, teamwork, right? If one falls, there's someone there to help you. If you do it all on your own and you fall and you're alone and you don't have God in the picture to give you help and guidance, you're going to fail, right? You can protect each other. There's strength in numbers, and then also there's this idea of keeping each other warm. And he wasn't talking about some kind of sexual thing, laying with your mate or something, or your spouse. It was more of just this idea of there's protection and warmth in each other. We can keep each other warm. And it might even be going into the world of, like, if you know the story of King David, when he was fallen ill, they needed him to lay with someone to keep him warm. It's kind of an understanding, not a sexual kind of thing. Okay? And then he mentions this whole, triple braided cord is not easily broken. This idea that, 2 strands is great, but 3 is hard to break, right? It's stronger. And some of the commentaries I read referenced that maybe this 3rd cord is actually representing God, right? So it's you, right? And it's other people, and it's God making this unbreakable twine. This is something to think about, okay? So, you guys are good so far, right? So, yeah, we're good. All right, man, we're cooking. We're moving on, right? So here we are in verse 13. We're going to start talking about wisdom, right? But even though wisdom is good, wisdom without God is, once again, vanity. It's like, smoke in the wind. All right, smoke on the water. There's another song for you. Man, you're rolling out here, right? Okay, so here's the deal, guys. Verse 13, it says this: it is better to be poor, let me start again. It is better to be a poor but wise youth than an old and foolish king who refuses all advice. Right? He's like, look, it's better to be poor and young but smart than some old, super rich king guy big leader guy who refuses to take advice. There's no wisdom there, right? Then he continues on in verses 14 through 16. He says, such a youth could rise from poverty and succeed. He might even become king, though he has been in prison. So the wisdom will take him far out of even prison into being the leader. People will follow. It's great. But then everybody rushes to the side of yet another youth. So you have your shining moment, he's saying, but it's fleeting, right? It's a vanity. Right? It just will go away. People will forget you. Endless crowds stand, verse 16, endless crowds stand around him, but then another generation grows up and rejects him too. So it's all meaningless. It's like chasing the wind, right? So in verse 14, he says, look, wisdom helped the young boy be king. Verse 15 is, because everyone loves a Cinderella story, right? He's loved, he's followed. But then verse 16 says, look, Solomon's like, life's not a fairy tale. It isn't the way it works. And eventually he's forgotten. I think what we get from this section is that wisdom is good, but even with great wisdom, you'll be forgotten. But wisdom is good without, let me say that again. Wisdom is good, but without God, it's useless, right? So wisdom's good for a while, but you have wisdom without the God piece, without God in your story, without God in your life, right? Without the focus and the fear of God and the obedience to Him, then really that wisdom is completely useless, right? It doesn't matter how wonderful your life is if you don't have God. Would you agree? Amen? I can attest to that. All those years that I lived, without God. Thank you, Lord, for saving me, right? For sure. All right, man, we're hitting chapter 5. We got 7 more verses to go. 7. All right, here we go. Now he's changing gears. So we went through that chapter 4 where he was talking about these things, but he's really saying, looking at the view of that view of those things, right? And God wasn't in the picture. Well, now God's back in. And now he's saying, look, let me tell you just some nuggets of wisdom, how to relate, how to talk to God, how we should approach God. A moment, lost my microphone. All right, so here's what he says. This is chapter 5, verses 1 through 2. It says, as you enter the house of God, right, keep your ears open and your mouth shut. Like, shut up, right? It is evil to make mindless offerings to God. Don't make rash promises and don't be hasty in bringing matters before God. Like why God, and just complaining to Him. After all, God is in heaven and you are here on earth. So let your words be few, right? So when you worship God, listen a lot and speak a little, right? You do remember your sinfulness. Remember to be who you're talking to, because, right? I think Solomon's saying here, realize that, don't be a fool. Don't consider that you don't do anything evil, that you have nothing, that would disappoint God. Be true. It's okay. God will forgive you, but just watch your step. Don't feel the need to be quick to say anything. Remember that God in heaven, He's in heaven, and you're not, right? He knows what you and I need. He's in complete control, right? And that's a good thing. I'm glad that He's in control, to be honest, right? So you want to hear what He says, right? Rather than Him hearing what you think. Think about that one. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe God wants to hear your questions and even your, I don't understand. It doesn't make sense, God. I truly believe God's okay with it. I have those conversations. But God also wants you to just okay, be quiet, listen to me, right? In other words, I think Solomon's saying, humble yourself, settle down, listen to God. That's what we should do when we come to worship Him, okay? Then verse 3, he gives us, I would say, a proverb here, a nugget of wisdom. He says this in verse 3. Too much activity gives you restless dreams. Too many words make you a fool. Now, be careful who you say that to, right? Yeah, I know it's from the Bible, but you talk too much. Girl, you never, just don't do that, right? So, but here's the idea that if you don't want to be like the fool who isn't careful about his words and just talks, right? Think first. It's like being proactive versus reactive. Think before you speak with God, right? All right. Here's this idea also that he talks about when you're making a vow or a promise. Mean it. If you say it, mean it, right? So he says, verses 4 through 6, he says this. When you make a promise to God, don't delay in following through, for God takes no pleasure in fools. Keep all your promises you make to Him. It is better to say nothing than to make a promise and not keep it. Don't let your mouth make you sin. I like that, right? Whew. And don't defend yourself by telling the temple messenger that the promise you made was a mistake. That would make God angry, and He might wipe out everything you've achieved. Right? So in other words, mean what you say, and say what you mean. Right? And when that whole part where he's talking about, don't defend yourself by telling the temple messenger that the promise you made was a mistake. He's like, back in Old Testament Israel, when you made a vow to God, there was someone present, like a priest was present to make it a formal promise, like a covenant, right? He's like, don't make a promise and then have to go back to that priest, if you will, and be like, oh, time out, it's just kidding, it was just a mistake, Mean what you say what you mean. Don't take lightly any promises you make to God, right? Because your words and your vows should matter. Your covenant with God that you make should matter, okay? Let me end with this, guys. He ends then this section, verse 7, with another proverb, another nugget of wisdom. He says this: talk is cheap, like daydreams and other useless activities. And then this is so important. He says, fear God instead. Talk is cheap, right? That don't mean anything. It's just like daydreams, daydreaming to be a rock star. What, right? It's just, right? It's useless. Don't talk. Fear God. Obey Him. Love Him. Be in relationship with Him, right? The important foundation of really the whole book of Ecclesiastes is this: fear God. And you can do this by really considering the things that you say to God. He's saying, be careful what you say and how you say it, right? And then if you do say things to Him, right, be thoughtful of it. That's what He's kind of giving us in this beginning of chapter 5. So let me wrap this up, guys. God is very much in the picture in this last section of verses 1 through 7, right? In other words, Solomon was teaching us how we should relate to Him with our words. But overall, so far, where we're at, and throughout the whole book of Ecclesiastes, I believe this to be true, that we are called to love, to honor, to give reverence, to give glory, to fear God. Is really only the sure foundation for building one's life, okay? In fact, the only hope of enduring the present, this trial of life that we're going through, is to fear and obey God, right? Out of a loving relationship, just like we would with, our father or mother here on the world, right? Here on earth, right? So, let me give you a quick wrap-up of what we were talking about today. And it was a lot. Thanks for hanging in there. And first, Solomon talked about the injustice of it all, right? That there's these injustices, there's corruption. It's true then, it's true today. But he says, but it's okay. God's got His time. There's going to be a judgment for all of us, the good and the bad, right? And thank God that Jesus came. I just have to, right, to allow us to be, free of those sins, to be washed of them. He also talks about being humbled. He's like, look, when we look at the world, especially if we look at it without God, we're no different than the animals. We live, we die, right? What makes us different than the animals is that judgment that comes, right, that we will be judged by God, that we're made in God's image, okay? He then moves into this idea of enjoying life, right? So if you got these things, these injustices, and this humbleness going on, then just enjoy life. Worry about the present. Don't even worry. Just enjoy the present, right? Do your job, do your portion, do what God's called you to do, and don't worry about it, because He's in control, He's got it. And then he talks about in the world of work and that, he's like, there's supposed to be a balance. And don't envy others who have more stuff or have a better job, and don't be lazy. Don't sit around and just, be idle. And then he also talks about companionship, how important relationship is with each other, and relationship with the Father in heaven, I believe he's talking about too, right? And then he kind of wraps it up with this idea of that young person with wisdom being king. He says, wisdom is good, but without God, it's meaningless. It's nothing. So wisdom along with God, that's a good thing. And then he finally just kind of ends the whole thing that, like, so here's what we got to do. We got to love, right? We have to focus on God, right? We should be focused on God. That life without God at the center is meaningless. Okay? It's this whole idea that we should set God as the only way. Okay? So, thanks for being with me. I know that was somewhat long today, but you're awesome, and I hope that this resonates with you, and I hope that that you got something out of it that speaks to you, because I know me studying it did. And if you're confused, just read through it. There's lots of commentaries out there. Like I said, I found reading the Message version was actually pretty helpful to start with it, to make sense of it, and then dig into whatever version you like that seems to make more sense to you. So let me pray, and I hope you have a great week. And man, thanks for hanging out with me down in my studio. Woo! So here we go. Father, thanks for your word. Thanks for your wisdom that you give us. Thank you that you actually said that all we have to do is ask, and that you'll give that wisdom to us. Thank you that you're in complete control. And I know there are things that we don't understand, and help us just be okay with that. Just that there's a mystery about you, but it doesn't mean you don't love us, and it help us understand that means that doesn't mean that we should just give up or lose our faith in you. Okay. I ask that the things that we learned today, the main thing is just to keep you the focus. I ask that you allow us to do that. Speak to us in ways this week and beyond that helps us really focus in on who you are and what you want, the wisdom that you would give us for our lives. So anyway, Lord, thank you, and thanks for everyone watching today. Lord, bless everyone, protect us. We do pray that life gets back to normal, whatever that looks like. We just know you're in charge of it all, and we thank you for protecting us in it so far. Thanks for loving us, and pray it all in his son's name. Amen. Guys, have a great week, and I hope to see you soon, right? Cool. Rock on. What?